Hello, I'm Frances Deegan Horowitz, President of the City University Graduate Center. Welcome to Women, a series of programs for and about us. I'm so pleased to welcome Diane McWhorter, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Carry Me Home, a very personal history of the civil rights movement. Now, the Birmingham, Alabama native is teaching young readers the lessons she learned in her first book. She's written a book called A Dream of Freedom, the Civil Rights Movement from 1954 to 1968. It's just been published by Scholastic Nonfiction. Welcome.
Thank you.
Indeed, you grew up in Birmingham.
I did.
A child of white privilege, would that be fair to say that?
Well, somebody said I was more a grandchild of white privilege because my father was kind of the black sheep, but yes, but I would say that, certainly.
And you were 9, 10 years old when Kennedy was assassinated. You were 15 when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And you were there when they bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church and killed those 4 young girls in the church. What was your awareness of all of that growing up?
Well, the white folks that I grew up with lived over the mountain, as it was called, and the mountain was this dividing line between the gritty city and the privileged suburbs. And I just was pretty much unaware of what was going on. I was vaguely aware that Martin Luther King had come to town because our mothers told us that we could no longer go downtown to the movies. This was the day before the multiplex, and so all the movies were downtown. And my classmate in 5th grade at the Brook Hill School for Girls was Mary Badham, who was scout in To Kill a Mockingbird. And that movie had opened in Birmingham, as it turned out, as I learned in my research, the very day that Martin Luther King began the big mass marches in Birmingham in April of 1963. And we had been going down every Saturday to see matinees of it, and we practically memorized the entire script. And then one day, and it was the day after the police dogs and fire hoses were brought out against the child demonstrators in Birmingham, that everybody's seen the famous footage and photographs. After that, our mother said, you couldn't go down there anymore. And that, if you ask somebody my age in Birmingham to a person, white person, they will say that is the effect of the demonstrations personally on them. And I don't remember learning about the church bombing, and for a while I was, it was in my consciousness for for as long as I can remember, but I don't remember where I was or what I was doing when I heard about it. And I remember being surprised to realize that Kennedy was assassinated only 2 months later, and I remember everything about that, of course, as does anybody who experienced it. And one thing I vividly remember about that is that people cheered when the news came that he had been shot. And this was enacted all over the city. White school children cheered.
Cheered?
Yeah. Now, my group cheered when he got shot. And I did not, because for some reason my best friend was a Kennedy supporter, and she managed John Edwards' presidential campaign in New Hampshire. So she had populist politics or something in her blood. But anyway, I knew that she was going to be upset, so that's how I know I did not join in the cheers. Although my family was very much against Kennedy. Nobody cheered when one of the older girls at the school came onto the playing field where we were playing some game, I can't remember what it was, and said that he had died. And but all over the city, the white children were elated. But that was because what they had been taught by their parents.
Right. So how did you come out of that to where you are now?
Well, everybody asks me that, and I wish I had a soundbite, but I don't. And
was it going to Wellesley and getting to the Northeast?
I think so. And although segregation ended when I was 11. That's when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. So I never really, I think that people, and I think it's around that age where you have to deform your conscience in order to accept something that is clearly wrong. And the adult white Southerners all had to go through that in order to live under this totally undemocratic, unchristian system, despite the fact that, they were solid churchgoers. So I never had to go through those sort of moral contortions to accept it. And segregation had always seemed, I was always sort of aware of it, whereas later on, to most people it comes to seem normal. So so I never quite internalized it, I think, and that was one thing. But I also went to college at the height of the counterculture, and so I was sort of part of the anti-Vietnam War generation, and that racial past just I shed immediately as soon as I got to college, and it wasn't until about 10 years later that I became interested in writing about it.
But you know, there's a lot of research that says that when young people go off to college and they go away from their families, their attitudes and so on go under revision and they change. But after college, when they go back to their communities, they basically drift back to those attitudes. But that didn't happen with you.
Well, I didn't go back, and I remember thinking, I was a sort of a French major. I didn't like the French major, so I called it comp lit, but I spent my junior year in Paris, and I thought I was going to be an expatriate writer. I was so not identified with Alabama once I had gone away to college, and it wasn't until my late 20s that I thought, hey, what happened there, for a series of reasons, but and that's when I went back and started writing about it. But so I never settled back there. My generation is not particular. The people who stay there are not racist, particularly. And in fact, the reaction to my book "Carry Me Home" was almost one of relief among my friends.
Why did you write "Carry Me Home"?
Well, one reason was that my father was so odd. And I really wanted to understand him. And he had been the renegade of this prominent family. His mother had gone to Wellesley, and so I was destined to go there. And his father had gone to Harvard Law School. And so he came out of this sort of country club, Ivy League family, and was just this kind of wild guy, and hung out at beer joints, and was dropped out of college, and was a Marine, and was vocally racist when I was growing up, and we polite white children were taught that we could never use the N-word, and my father used that, and so he was just really wanted to understand him, and he would go out at night to what he called civil rights meetings, and I was wondered what was going on there, and became afraid that he had been a member of the Klan. But when I was growing up, I was so establishment, and I was so mainstream, and I was the whitest of the white girls. I mean, I was the president of my sorority, and just completely mainstream at this private girls' school. And so it was too painful and threatening for me to deal with that then. So I reacted to his rebellion by becoming the most conformist kid you could imagine. And interestingly, I sort of ended up being the black sheep too by writing about what I did. So that was the Freudian reason for doing it. But as a journalist, I just couldn't understand how. As a journalist, I wanted to sort of solve the church bombing, because one of the chief perpetrator had been prosecuted in 1977. So that was 14 years after the crime. And then there were about 4 other suspects that had never been brought to justice. And I just wondered how they had gotten away with it, because the standard line in Birmingham was they were just a bunch of rednecks and lunatic fringe, and they gave us a bad name. And I thought, well, if they were that marginal, why weren't they, sort of brought to the altar of justice? And because Birmingham had this stain that they just could not get rid of because of this crime that had never been solved or, redeemed in any way. So that was another reason. I just was curious about how that could happen.
And did you ever find out why your father was going out to these so-called civil rights meetings?
I never answered the question specifically. There's in the epilogue of Carry Me Home, there's a transcript of this interview I did with him where I every time I would go home, I would try to get more out of him. And it was almost like Scheherazade, where he would, keep telling me, spinning these tales that didn't quite make sense. And so he never really, I determined that he was not a member of the Klan. And I don't know what he was doing. He may have been just getting away from the family and drinking and chasing women or something. But I answered the question in a larger way. And the two subjects turned out to be related. What explained him, what made him tick, and how the church bombing took place. And that was and why it was never really solved. And what I came up realizing was that I thought my father was a freak and that he was just this mystery. And then what I realized was that he was actually just expressing the values of his family and the people around him, and even the country club set. And I found out, and I realized too, that the reason the Klan really never got caught was because they had been protected by the leading citizens of the city for many years. And by the time they had bombed the church, they had been sort of abandoned by City Hall, by the city fathers, because they had started giving racism a bad name by getting out of control and causing a lot of civil strife. But for a great long time, they had really enforced the status quo that maintained what they call peace in the valley and enabled the heavy manufacturers who ran the city to really operate pretty much free of any kind of labor, quote, agitation or anything like that. And so they had been encouraged, and in some cases had gotten direct orders from some of these leading citizens, and they were called the big mules, the big industrialists in town. So in a way, the answers were parallel, that the Klan that bombed the church had been this expression of the city's ruling elite in a way that my father was an expression of his own community.
But the Klan was not only protected, it was enabled. I mean,
yeah,
coming to this book that we'll come to in a minute, in some instances, there was an agreement that the Klan would attack and they would be given time to do so before the police would step in.
Correct. In Birmingham in particular, the police were in cahoots with the Klan and protected them. And one policeman I interviewed for Carry Me Home said that he said, well, we agreed with what they were doing, and they could do things that we couldn't get, that we were bound by law, restrained by law from doing. And so they were sort of really part of the same, enforcing the same status quo. It's just that the Klan could bust heads and be protected by the police in doing so.
And did this fundamentally change, or did it only change on the surface?
Oh, it changed fundamentally, because what you have now and what you see, interestingly, is that the Chamber of Commerce is now on the side of the civil rights movement. And this started happening in Birmingham because it was the Chamber of Commerce that ultimately made a deal with Martin Luther King in Birmingham in 1963 to end the demonstrations, because it was just killing the city economically. And when the Chamber of Commerce stopped using the Klan, it was because they were doing things that got bad publicity for the city. And they didn't care about publicity as long as there was this heavy manufacturing economic base, because that was not a service economy. They didn't have to worry about their image. People weren't going to boycott steel. But once the economy started changing in the late 50s and it started moving to a consumer and service economy, then they did have to worry about the image of Birmingham, and the image was just terrible. They couldn't get businesses to locate offices down there. If they did get businesses down there, they couldn't get their people to move down there because they were afraid the schools were going to be closed, or the parks were going to be closed, which is what happened in Birmingham. So it was sort of economics that drove this change of heart on the part of the economic establishment in town, and that change of heart was brought about by the civil rights movement, which created this situation where it became economically untenable. Well, I think that that there was this sort of one different approaches between Christians and Jews, is that for Jews, correct action precedes faith, so that if you do good deeds, then sort of goodness, morality follows. Whereas with Christians, it's that faith precedes correct action. And I think what you see in places like Birmingham is that when you are forced to make a correction in your actions, then sometimes the mind and heart will follow. Will follow the acts. And I think that you see that to a certain extent in Birmingham, that there's been this enormous change in attitudes on one hand. But on the other hand, as it turned out, the white people didn't really have to give up that much, because the sticking point in at the time of Martin Luther King's death, certainly, and what remains the sticking point is economic justice and economic equality. And as long as the white people didn't really have to give up control of the money, they were able to live with this transformation, which was significant. It's just that it only went so far.
Yes, because there is not economic parity.
Right, and that's where we are today, and that's where you see the injustices played out.
Why did you write this book, A Dream of Freedom, the Civil Rights Movement from 1954 to 1968, for young people from 9 on up? Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, from a career or personal point of view, I had wanted to, I wasn't ready to leave the subject of civil rights because I had spent 19 years writing Carry Me Home, and I just had been steeped in this material, and I thought about writing a sequel to Carry Me Home about Birmingham, bringing the city up to date with the much belated trials of the 2 last living suspects in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, which took place right when Carry Me Home was coming out. And so I was trying to figure out what to do, and then a friend of mine who's in the publishing business came to me and suggested that I do this. And as soon as he did, I went, oh yeah, that's a great idea, because I had been raising children of my own and seeing how the civil rights movement was taught to them. And it was pretty dismaying, I would say. The impressions that they were getting from their exposure to it as young kids.
And did you have to do a lot of research for this?
No, I didn't. The hard thing was dialing it back, and because I knew too much. I was pretty good through 1965, which is the Selma to Montgomery March, and then the movement kind of fragments after that. That was sort of the last hurrah of the big nonviolent Martin Luther King Southern church-based movement, and which brought about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which enabled African Americans to really finally achieve, to get political justice. And then, as I said, then the issue becomes economic, the struggle moves north, and the movement realized how intractable the problems were. So I wasn't as clear on that, or didn't have the details at my fingertips, so I did have to do some research on that.
But this is told in a very spare manner. And as you go through it with the kind of detail, unembellished, because you don't spare anything here, it is a very moving account.
Well, it was kind of thrilling just to pare it down to exactly why this was important and what it meant, but then tell it as a narrative through a child's eyes. So, for example, with Brown versus the Board of Education, I begin with which outlawed separate but equal schools in the country. I began with the black and white dolls that the social psychologist Kenneth Clark showed to black children, and their reactions, that they did not want to identify with their own skin color, and that they had internalized this prejudice and this pain. And so I knew, gosh, I mean, the kids will understand dolls immediately. And the children were so instrumental in so many of the battles during the movement that it was really great to be able to tell it through their eyes as much as possible. One of the things that I was noticing when my kids were learning about the movement was that, number one, they thought that Martin Luther King had done everything single-handedly, and they pretty much thought that all he did was get up and say he had a dream, and everybody kind of went, oh my God, why didn't you say so? And so I wanted them to know that it was, first of all, it was an incredible fight, and that because you almost see his nonviolent stress to the point of absurdity, as it, and it's almost like a cautionary thing. Now, y'all don't get too upset now. And Martin Luther King was nonviolent, and I wanted them to see what a struggle it was, and that it was a nonviolent fight on the part of the movement, but not on the part of the white people. And the other thing was that the kids learn about the movement at such an early age because of the King holiday, that they really aren't ready for the really ugly stuff. And I remember when my daughter was in second grade, and she came home with this newsletter saying that Martin Luther King taught people how to solve problems, solve disagreements without fighting, and you didn't read a thing about segregation. They refer to his enemies as the people who disagreed with him, as if this was some honest argument. And so it's a kind of a dilemma, because the kids are really too young to hear about lynching, and which was the linchpin of this whole system.
And the murder of Emmett Till.
Oh yeah, and just the incredible brutality of the white people and of the state. I mean, the white state is really disturbing when you see how the governors acted, how the universities behaved, and so they kind of cruise into middle school thinking that knowing about Rosa Parks refusing to give her a seat on the bus, thinking that segregation was water fountains and back of the bus, and really having no understanding of how systemic it was, and how it really, one thing I wanted to get across was how the South, which is seen as an aberration in the country, is really a magnification of the issues in the country. It makes very concrete what is going on in the rest of the country. And you see this today just with the religious and stuff, and just the values things, that this is so much more vivid in the South than it is elsewhere. But it is a national phenomenon. So I really wanted them to understand the South as a way of seeing themselves, and that the people were not freaks, they were normal people. And I use my own case as an example of how good, decent people can go along with a system that's patently wrong if it starts to feel normal. And it felt normal to the citizens of the South, and indeed of the country, because segregation was legal up until 1954 in Brown versus the Board.
But, take the case of segregation. It's outlawed, but I haven't been in Birmingham recently, but I suspect the public schools in the city of Birmingham, like the public schools all over this country in urban areas, are essentially resegregated. Only they're black now, instead of black, some for black and some for white.
Yeah, one of the sort of chilling details in A Dream of Freedom is that Ruby Bridges, who was the adorable 6-year-old African-American girl who was among the first wave of kids to desegregate a school in the Deep South, and she desegregated her school in New Orleans, and essentially the school closed down for a year, and she was the only person in the classroom. And her nieces went back to that school, 30 years later, and the school was almost completely black, or was completely black at that point, so there had been resegregation. It's a dilemma all over the country. And,
but does it, in some ways, doesn't it take away from what people think of as the victories of the civil rights movement?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the thing that really stalled school desegregation, though, was the national backlash against court-ordered busing. And the Birmingham of that battle was Boston. Right. So you see how it is this national thing. As soon as, and when Dr. King took the civil rights movement to Chicago, he was completely stymied. And the black politicians in Chicago who had come down to Selma a year earlier in 1965 to march with him completely thwarted him against Mayor Daley when he came to Chicago in 1966. So it's a national problem. It's complicated, and the book ends on a kind of bittersweet note, because the king is killed, and he has come to define the issues as economic opportunity, and that's still what we face.
And I think still that while on many fronts things could be said to be improved, are the basic issues of racism not still with us?
Well, I think that certainly in Birmingham, people are shocked when they go to Birmingham because of the easy relationships between blacks and whites in the workplace. I mean, and this is kind of typical in the country as well, that there is true integration in the workplace. People work together collegially, and certainly there's still discrimination in the workplace, but by and large, there's a lot of fraternizing. It doesn't go into Sunday morning at church, and it doesn't go into the evening hours at home. There's still social segregation, and
it doesn't go into the schools.
No, no. The most integrated my experience my own girls had, actually, that even though they went to public schools for elementary school, was at a private school in New York, and in middle school for my older daughter. That was the most, integrated experience in a way, because the school that she had gone to, the public school she had gone to, was had very few African Americans in it. It was a magnet school that had been designed to get white people back into the school system. Mm-hmm. So yeah, no, it's still a problem. It's again, a lot of some of the resegregation has been endorsed by African Americans now, because it wasn't working out, and it's really a shame that that was such a failure, and that busing didn't work. But it didn't.
It sure didn't. You have written a very affecting book that will be quite an antidote to the sort of sugar-covered celebrations of Martin Luther King Day that goes on in many of our schools. Mm-hmm. We could talk much more about this, but I'm sorry we're out of time. My thanks to Diane McWhorter for joining me. A Dream of Freedom, the Civil Rights Movement from 1954 to 1968, has just been published by Scholastic Nonfiction. For the City University Graduate Center and Women to Women, I'm Frances Deegan Horowitz.